Hello everyone, and thank you for joining me for another tier list. Today we are going to be going through the discography of Kraftwerk. Kraftwerk is inarguably one of the most influential and important bands to come out of Germany in the early 70s, and they were one of the first pioneers of the electronic music genre, and they have influenced countless bands and artists over these past 5 decades. And without Kraftwerk and their fearlessness to branch out and explore new sounds and figure out different ways to utilize these sounds into their music, it's pretty hard to imagine where electronic music would have gone without them being such a pivotal part of the genre. And in addition to electronic, they've also been a key source of inspiration within pop and hip-hop music, amongst many other subgenres as well. So this will be a very fun episode to cover, and what I'm going to do is go through their 10 studio albums, going from Kraftwerk up to Tour de France soundtracks, and I'll score each of them on this tier list, with S being the highest and D being the lowest, and I'll talk a little bit about each album, let you know my thoughts, and we will see where we end up. And please feel free to let me know your thoughts in the comments, where you agree and disagree, and how you would rank these 10 albums. I would love to hear your thoughts. Alright, I think that's about it. Let's jump right into it. Okay, starting out, we have their debut studio album from 1970, which is a self-titled album, and I will give this one a D, unfortunately. Not a great first release, in my opinion, but I don't think I'm in the minority for thinking that. Stylistically, this is very different from the stuff that they would release from 1974 and onward, and in this initial formation, Kraftwerk was a 4-piece band with original 2 founding members, Ralf Hutter and Florian Schneider, in addition to Klaus Dinger and Andreas Hoffmann, and the electronic elements were much less present on their first 2 albums, and instead were more centered around this sort of fusion of krautrock, avant-garde, and psychedelic rock. And while I do think there are aspects of this style that are interesting and fun to listen to, I don't think that it translates into a very good and engaging album, and there is a big chunk of this record that does feel like a little bit of work to get through. The album features 4 tracks ranging between 7 and 12 minutes in length, and the songs veer in and out of all of those different styles that I had mentioned, and throughout the album there might be a cool groove or a cool section to a song here and there, but overall I do have a hard time with the majority of this 39-minute album, but I do appreciate it for what it is in terms of musical experimentation and them exploring their sound, trying to figure out which direction they want to go in. But unfortunately, this is my least favorite Kraftwerk album, so starting out, I think I'm going to have to give this one a D. Alright, next we have their second studio album from 1972 titled Kraftwerk 2, and I will give this one a C. Still not a great release, but I would say it is a slight improvement from the first album. On here, the lineup has been stripped down to just Ralf and Florian, and stylistically it is very similar to the first release with the mix of experimental, avant-garde, and krautrock, and again, only minimal use of electronics. But for me, the thing that does make this album a little bit better is the opening track, Ding Dong, which is a 17-minute adventure that does give us some electronic flavors mixed with acoustic instruments. And I think this is the first song where you do get some hints of future Kraftwerk in terms of the grooves and overall feel of the song. I also think that track 3, titled Current, has some really cool moods going on between the guitars, bass, and flute. The remainder of the album does have some moments here and there that I do find enjoyable, but again, there still is a chunk of this album that I do find challenging to get through, but it does deliver a couple of good tracks that are an improvement upon what we heard from the first release, but I wouldn't say that this is an album that I go back and revisit very often. So not a great album, but slightly better than the first release, so I will give this one a C. Alright, next we have their third studio album from 1973 titled Ralf und Florian, and I will actually give this one an A. I think this is a very good album, and I consider it to be one of the more underrated Kraftwerk albums. Granted, it's not on the same level as a lot of the albums that would follow it, and it is stylistically still in this territory where they are continuing to explore and find their sound, which creates this interesting fusion of experimental and avant-garde mixed with some very lush and euphoric electronic and ambient tracks, as well as some hints of that krautrock sound that we got from the first 2 releases, but much, much less than those first 2 albums. All 6 songs on this album, I think, are unique in their own ways and provide for a very fun and adventurous listening experience, especially especially if you are a fan of vibey, ambient albums that go in a lot of different directions. For favorite tracks on here, I love the way it opens up with Electric Roulette, a very engaging song that really gets your attention and features lots of interesting sequences, good melodies, and some solid instrumental grooves mixed with electronics in a very nice way. Track 3, titled Crystals, gives us a very vibey electronic track that sounds incredibly ahead of its time and sounds like a precursor to an artist like Aphex Twin. My number one favorite track on here, though, by far, is track 4, titled The Bells of Home. Such an incredibly beautiful track with really sweet piano parts, and the flute doubling the melody on top creates such a dreamy and pretty atmosphere. By far my favorite song from the first 3 Kraftwerk albums, and again, another song that sounds like it could be a precursor to Brian Eno. My other favorite track on here would be Dance Music. Again, another very cool electronic track with beautiful melodies, and another one that sounds like it could be another precursor to Aphex Twin. So I think this album is loaded with good stuff, and while I may not revisit it as much as some of the other Kraftwerk albums, I do think that this album has some very strong contributions and is a significant improvement upon the first 2 releases, and very clearly shows us that there is a lot more great stuff on the horizon for this group. So a great and underrated Kraftwerk record. I will give this one an A. Alright, now we have their 4th studio album from 1974 titled Autobahn, and probably not a surprise to anyone, I'm going to give this one an S. Absolutely incredible album, and this would go down as my 3rd favorite Kraftwerk album. This was a record that was a breakthrough for them and gave us our first taste of their electronic pop side with the utilization of lots of different synths and drum machines, but still utilizing some acoustic instruments as well, like flute, violin, and guitar, but very different stylistically from the first 3 releases, and in my opinion, this is the first amazing album to kickstart this incredible journey that is the Kraftwerk discography. The album features 5 tracks and is mostly centered around the theme of driving on Germany's Autobahn, and the music is meant to reflect that. All of side 1 is taken up by the 22-minute title track, and this one would definitely make my top 10 favorite Kraftwerk song list, and is, in my opinion, one of the most fun, engaging, and exciting 22 minutes of music ever written. It's got beautiful melodies, tasteful and adventurous synth sounds and sequences, feel-good grooves, and the first Kraftwerk song to feature any sort of vocals, which opens up a whole nother avenue of their music that they will continue to explore on future releases. A perfect opener to this album, and a song that does exactly what it is intended to do. It really evokes that imagery of driving on the highway. Side 2 then features 4 more tracks, all veering between 4 and 6 minutes in length, and we do take some twists and turns, with some songs being more experimental and others being more electronic pop and having more melodic components to them. So a great mix of this new side of Kraftwerk, but still incorporating some experimental and avant-garde elements that are more similar to their first 3 albums. A fun sequence of songs to follow up the title track from side 1. And my other favorite song on here would have to be Comet Melody 2. Such beautiful melodies, and another very catchy and moody song. So an amazing album. For 1974, this was clearly a groundbreaking album that was ahead of its time, and will forever be one of the most important albums for electronic music. So, amazing record. My 3rd favorite Kraftwerk album. This one gets an S. Okay, moving on, we have their 5th studio album from 1975 titled Radioactivity, and I will give this one an A. Definitely a very good album, but for me, I would say it is a slight downgrade from Autobahn, which is obviously a very tough record to follow. But regardless, for 1975, this album was clearly very ahead of its time and very innovative for the world of electronic music, as well as that unique fusion of electronic elements with experimental and avant-garde. And I think they did a really great job of putting out something that is still very high quality, but also contrasts Autobahn very nicely and shows you that this band is going to go in all sorts of interesting territories in in a very fearless way, and it shows that there is a lot of stuff to be excited for on future releases. This album marked a turning point in a couple of different ways for the band. This is their first fully electronic album and is also a concept album centered around the radio and themes of radio communication and radioactive decay, and it would also be the first album to feature the classic Kraftwerk lineup, which is Ralf Hutter, Florian Schneider, Karl Bartos, and Wolfgang Flür. And musically, we have a lot of amazing and unique synth sounds being utilized throughout, lots of interesting sequences, and a great use of the vocoder. The tracks veer between the different stylistic elements that they are mixing together in a very nice way. And I would say for me personally, one of the reasons why I did put this in A tier is that the amount of shorter transitional tracks that are on here do hurt the momentum for me a bit at times. But those are clearly the more avant-garde moments from the album, and I still appreciate them from an exploratory standpoint. In my opinion, the strongest tracks on here are all of the longer, more fleshed out songs, with my favorites being Radioactivity, Antenna, Airwaves, and Radioland. So I wouldn't say that every single song on here is a home run, but there are certainly some very strong moments, and I would say that I really love about 85% of this album, and I also really enjoy the amount of vocal work that we get throughout this record. So a solid follow-up to Autobahn, and again, a very innovative and important album in the world of electronic music that was very ahead of its time for 1975. So a great album. This one will get an A. Alright, moving on, we have their sixth studio album from 1976 titled Trans-Europe Express, and this one will get an easy S. Another incredible album, and for me this would go down as my second favorite Kraftwerk album. To me, this one contains a little bit of every side that I love from Kraftwerk. The theme of this album is centered around Europe and the European railway service, and for me personally, the thing that I love so much about this album is the way that the mood shifts from the beginning to the end. It opens up on a more feel-good poppy mood with Europe Endless, but then right after that, it takes some darker and eerier turns with The Hall of Mirrors and Showroom Dummies. Showroom Dummies is one of my favorite Kraftwerk songs, would definitely make my top 5 favorite Kraftwerk track list. I just love the vibe of that song so much. It's groovy, but also ominous, and creates this really fascinating mood. Side 2 gives us 5 more tracks, opening up with the title track, Trans-Europe Express, which has got to be one of the coolest sounding songs ever written, and another one that would definitely make my top 5 favorite Kraftwerk song list. Another amazingly dark and eerie song with so many cool sounds going on. A couple of the remaining tracks on side 2 are themed off of the title track, and then the final 2 tracks veer off into their own thing and take us in all sorts of beautiful and rich territories. And again, I love that contrast, how the opening and ending parts of the album start a little more feel-good with some more beauty going on, and then the whole middle point is really just very eerie and dark and ominous. So an amazing album that really contains that perfect blend of beauty, groove, eeriness, and continued musical explorations on Kraftwerk's part. And yet again, as is the case with pretty much every album on here, another incredibly important and pivotal contribution to the world of electronic music. So another amazing album, my second favorite Kraftwerk album. This one gets an S. Okay, next we have their 7th studio album from 1978 titled The Man Machine, and I will give this one an S. Absolutely incredible album, and for me this one goes down as my number 1 favorite Kraftwerk record. I think this album is perfect from front to back. All 6 songs on it are amazing. It's got a very good pacing to it, and it's a very easy listen. I think if somebody wants an introduction to Kraftwerk, I think this is the best album to show somebody starting out. It's got a really great blend of electronic with synth pop and new wave, and an album that would clearly have an impact on the trajectory of the new styles of music that were coming out of the late 70s and early 80s. Similar to Trans Europe Express, this album does have a pretty eerie vibe to it, which I really love. There are some truly spooky moments throughout these songs with all sorts of dark and ominous grooves and melodies. It's got two of the most classic Kraftwerk hits with The Robots and The Model, but the other four songs are all also incredible in their own regards. As far as track listing goes, I really love the placement and vibe of neon lights. I think that provides some really nice beauty to contrast the darker and more intense elements of this album. It's such a hard choice, but if I had to narrow it down to my favorite song on here, it would have to be Space Lab. I just love the mood of that song so much, and the synth sounds are so cool and eerie. But like I said, all 6 tracks on here are so amazing, it's hard to even pick a favorite. But just an incredible album and my number one favorite Kraftwerk album. Like I said, from front to back, I think this record is perfect. So this one gets an easy S. Okay, next we have their 8th studio album from 1981 titled Computer World, and I will also give this one an S. Another amazing album, and this would be my 4th favorite Kraftwerk album. I love the concept behind this record, clearly showing how forward-thinking this band was, and now listening to this album 40 years later, it's really amazing how true their predictions were about computers and technology and how so much of our life was going to become integrated with that. The album goes into that electronic synth pop direction and turns out a couple of really incredible songs like Computer World, Pocket Calculator, Computer Love, and It's More Fun to Compute, which wraps up the album in such a hard-hitting and badass manner. My personal favorite on here is Computer Love, and it also very well might be my number one favorite Kraftwerk song. I sort of go in between a couple of different tracks depending on what mood I'm in, but this one pretty regularly pops up as my favorite Kraftwerk song. Just such a dreamy and groovy track with amazing electronic sounds and great subtle use of vocals throughout it. And I do think that Autobahn, Trans Europe Express, and The Man Machine are better overall albums. For me, this album has always had one skip over track with Numbers. For some reason, I could just never get into that track, and that has been my one point of contention against this record. But aside from that, I think this album offers some incredibly high-quality individual tracks and a couple of their strongest individual songs to date as well, with songs like Computer Love and Computer World. So another amazing album. This one gets an S. Okay, moving on, we have their 9th studio album from 1986 titled Electric Cafe, and I'm going to give this one a B. Pretty underwhelming album in my opinion, at least in comparison to everything that had preceded it. There are definitely some good moments throughout it, but in its entirety, I would say that it is a downgrade from the previous 6 albums. This would also be the final album to feature that classic lineup of Ralph, Florian, Wolfgang, and Carl. We have 6 songs with 3 on each side, and there's a significant difference in mood between side 1 and side 2. Side 1 is a little more upbeat with a lot of emphasis on beats and voice sampling, and I find side 1 to be pretty flat and not terribly exciting. I would say that Technopop is the most enjoyable of the 3 songs, but even that one I think does go on for a bit too long and starts to drag. Side 2 veers into some darker territory and incorporates vocals on one track. I think side 2 does get a little better, particularly with the opening track, The Telephone Call, which would easily be my favorite song on here, and believe it or not, might even make my top 10 favorite Kraftwerk song list as well. I think this track is definitely the saving grace of this album. Such great vibes and great synth and vocal melodies. And a little fun fact, this is the only Kraftwerk song to feature Karl Bartos on lead vocals, and I would consider it to be a great one vocal song for him to have because I do think it is the high point of this album. I also really enjoy the follow-up track, Sex Object, another solid vocal track on more of the darker and mysterious vibe, which I always love. Again, though, another song where I do feel like it goes on for a tad long and starts to lose a little bit of momentum. I think the closing track, the title track, Electric Cafe, is also pretty cool. Another one in a similar vein to the other tracks on side 2 in more of that darker territory. But as you can see, I enjoy most of side 2. Side 1 has a few moments that I like, but I do find most of the tracks to be underwhelming or to drag on for a bit too long, and ultimately that does take away from the quality of this album a bit. So not a terrible album, but not a great one either. I will give this one a B. Okay, and last but not least, we have their 10th and most recent studio album from 2003 titled Tour de France Soundtracks, and I will give this one a B as well. This is an interesting album that I have a lot of conflicting thoughts about. It was their first release in 17 years, so I'm sure expectations were high, and I think that they do deliver to some extent. There are definitely some tracks on here that I think are awesome and sound like classic Kraftwerk, but I also do think that this album is a tad long at 56 minutes in length, and I do think that it does drag from time to time. And I think there are some songs on here that could have been taken out and may have helped with the pacing and momentum of the album at least a little bit. The theme of this album is centered around the Tour de France, and it takes their 1984 track of the same title and extends its theme into this full-length album. I absolutely love the way it opens with the 3 stages of Tour de France, in my opinion by far the strongest part of the album, and giving us some really amazing techno flavors, which we had also heard on the previous release. After the initial 4 tracks though, I do think that the momentum does dip down from time to time, and I don't think every single track that follows it is a home run, but there are certainly a couple of others that I really enjoy, like Vitamin and the closing track, Tour de France. But I would say not one of their best albums, but also not their worst either. Somewhere in between. But in the midst of that, we still have a handful of really amazing songs, and it is great to hear a further continuation of the techno side of Kraftwerk. So an okay last album, but not one of the best. I will give this one a B. Alright, so that is it. Those are my takes on their 10 studio albums. Such an enjoyable discography to go through. It cannot be overstated as to how important this band is, not only for electronic music, but for music in general. These guys were true pioneers who were not afraid to push the envelope and to continue to explore the natures of sound, as well as their very unique ability to explore different concepts through their music and really foreshadow a lot of futuristic things related to technology and computers, and they really envisioned the future in a pretty accurate way. So just an incredibly important band, and I'm glad that I was finally able to get around to covering their discography for this series. So that is it for today. I hope you enjoyed it, and hopefully you learned a thing or two. And if you are interested, feel free to check out some of my other tier lists, which will be linked in the comments and the description, and see if there's anything else that you might like. Thank you so much for listening, and I will see you at the next video. Take care.